Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Shop Talk. I'm Lindsay Harris, the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of the School of Classical Studies at the American Academy in Rome, and tonight it is my pleasure to introduce to you Kevin Dicus, recipient of the Andrew High School Postdoctoral Rome Prize in Ancient Studies. Kevin is a scholar of archaeology in the ancient Mediterranean, with a focus on Italy during the mid to late Republican period. He earned his doctorate from the Interdepartmental Program of Classical Art and Archaeology at the University of Michigan, and he is presently an assistant professor in the Department of Classics at the University of Oregon. He is also the excavation supervisor for the Pompeii Archaeological Research Project Porta Stabia, a position he has held for the past decade. Kevin has earned several honors for his archaeological research and his teaching, including a Rackham Humanities Dissertation Fellowship from the University of Michigan, an Etruscan Foundation Research Fellowship, and an Excellence in Teaching Award from the University of Arizona. He has also participated in a number of archaeological excavations in Italy, in Pompeii, as I mentioned, as well as in Tolfa, La Farnesiana, and Chianciano Terme. Kevin has built on this experience in recent years by collaborating with colleagues across disciplines to chart new ground in archaeological data analysis using digital technology. He has published important articles on these 21st century approaches to unearthing and making sense of antiquity, including most recently, Beyond Tablet Computers as a Tool for Data Collection, 3 Seasons of Processing and Curating Digital Data in a Paperless World. Kevin's recognition of paper and even tablet computers as soon to become, if not already, things to be discarded in the wake of modern innovation, speaks to the focus of his present research, namely, garbage. To most of us, this term might suggest uselessness, refuse, a burden to be gotten rid of. For Kevin, instead, as he will explain to us this evening, garbage and its various synonyms are words that brim with possibility. In a process that, as an historian of photography, I can't help but see as somehow photographic in nature, Kevin has developed a methodology that seeks to analyze something typically construed of as negative, that being waste, to bring to light new information, something positive, about antiquity. Trash deposits, dumps, litter, these noxious accumulations for Kevin present potential troves of insight into the makeup of the Roman world, particularly its cities. What does the content of a city's waste reveal about its inhabitants' values? What does the location of refuse signal about urban planning and evolution? How did trash fuel innovation and reuse? These are just some of the questions about ancient Rome that Kevin seeks to answer in his research, which, as I understand it, stems from his work on Pompeii, but has implications that reach much further across space and time. For any of us who has tried to throw out our own trash while at the Academy and found this seemingly straightforward task actually fairly difficult, or if while in Italy you've found yourself using and discarding plastic water bottles with far greater frequency than ever before, you will grasp immediately the import of Kevin's project. As among many things that have persisted from antiquity to today is a seemingly endless cycle of production and disposal that not only generates ever more creative ideas about waste management, but also, as Kevin will demonstrate tonight, encourages new ways of understanding history. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Dicus for his presentation this evening, Waste Not Waste, Managing Refuse in an Ancient City. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you guys for being here. Yeah, and thank you for that kind introduction. This is kind of difficult. I'm looking at waste from a number of different perspectives, and it was kind of difficult to really finalize what perspective I wanted to use tonight. So for some archaeologists, I hope I am at some points, preaching to the choir. Some of this I wish was common knowledge for many archaeologists, and for many it is. But in archaeology, very often waste is misunderstood. Its location, its formation, and its composition. And this does lead to problems. So how did a city deal with the quotidian task of dealing with its waste, ridding its living and working spaces of refuse? Now, I do deal with in the book literary epigraphic and legal texts, as well as the archaeological evidence. But tonight I'm just going to strictly stick with the archaeological evidence of waste management. What I want to do first is create sort of a general definition of a dump or a midden. How can we recognize a dump for what it is? I will then introduce 4 case studies, these cities that I will be using for my study, and that is Rome, Ostia, Cosa, and Pompeii, of course. And I will identify, based on the definition I established, the dumps at each of these sites, or some of the dumps. They are numerous, too numerous for me to cover entirely tonight. But I also want to look at greater detail at those many waste assemblages that do not correspond to the definition of dump. Okay, it is particularly these very large and very numerous assemblages of waste that can be found throughout each of these cities. What does it say about the systematic provision for the disposal of refuse? Finally, I want to explain why this matters. I will show how a misunderstanding of waste management strategies and a misidentification of the assemblages that archaeologists encounter can lead to grave misinterpretations of the archaeological record. In general, scholars really don't believe that there are provisions for the disposal of waste. Okay, you can see this perspective even in books that have been published in 2016. Okay, there really is no, according to many, centralized or systematic provision for the disposal of a city's refuse. I think this position, although misguided, stands firm for a couple of reasons. One, very few studies have been done on waste for waste's sake. Right? Happily, the trend in archaeology seems to be turning in favor of the more everyday, in favor of the more mundane. I can think of Kim's project, and Ted's too. But still, we lack evidence for waste management, simply really because we haven't looked for it. We get this argumentum ad ignorantiam. The absence of evidence becomes the evidence of absence. Second, we, meaning our modern Western world, evaluate waste in a singularly rigid way. It is meant to be disposed of permanently, where it can be forgotten and cease to exist. In this state of refuse, material culture loses all value. Now, this definition of refuse taken from an ethno-archaeological study on the subject illustrates this point. Refuse consists of the byproducts of any human activity that are deemed useless and therefore disposed of or abandoned. Okay. Now, we can now take this and extrapolate it backwards onto the objects and the refuse of the past. I'm going to take this quite famous little chart from the 1970s by Michael Schiffer that presents the 2 general stages in the life cycle of an object. And it is seen in terms of, we can say, life and death, right? Its life consists of the birth, when the object is made, and it lives while it is used and repaired and reused. But then it dies, and it enters into the dreaded archaeological context. Okay, the systemic context is the life, and it dies and enters. And notice there's no arrow back to the systemic context. It loses value, it's discarded, and there's no resurrection, right? Now, it's been rightly recognized that certain objects can make their way back to be reused and recycled. Landfills can be mined for objects whose use value might not be exhausted. Now, it's great. Ted Pena's here because I'm going to give him a shout out twice tonight. And he's got a great work on the Roman pottery and the archaeological record, which recognizes many ways pottery can be reused and sort of resurrected, I guess. Let's take it one step further. Let's move away from the impression of the dump as a repository of worthless junk and see it instead as a place of provisional storage, where everything, not just individual objects, can retain reuse value. Is there life after discard? Not in our society, perhaps, but in the Roman world, there very well could have been. The relationship the Romans had toward their waste shows, I believe, not just a systematic provision for the disposal and use of waste, but one that is in many ways more sophisticated and in every way more flexible than our own. Okay, the system was not always on fleek or efficient or salubrious. There must have been problems and breakdowns, as with any even modern city. But there was a system. Right? The Romans, masters of organization, surely organized their refuse as well. In order to look at waste disposal in the Roman world, I first needed to look at patterns of waste disposal. Now, since we really don't do this in the classical world so much, I went out and I poured through archaeological and ethno-archaeological research from other parts of the world, primarily the New World. I found that the logistics of waste disposal differs from place to place depending on several site attributes, such as urban density, right? What is the scope of urban development? What is the premium placed on space? What are the limitations of the space? Population pressure, how many people live in the site, occupying the space, generating waste. Boundedness, to what extent can a site expand? Is its boundary more open, or is it narrowly defined, perhaps by a city wall? Permanence, basically how long does occupation last at one site? Is the population sedentary or mobile? Okay, now all of these attributes determine where a site can be located. When we talk about location of a dump, we're talking specifically of one goal: hindrance avoidance. Okay, it should not encumber the daily routines of the inhabitants. It's disposed of away from its place of use. It does not impede movement. It should not offend the senses of the inhabitants nor negatively impact health. Okay, when the site attributes are on the lower end of the spectrum here, less intense, less density, less population pressure, we seem to have, from the patterns that I've established, a less intensive separation of waste from the people. Okay, it's still, hindrance avoidance is still accomplished, but it can be accomplished with less energy expended, right? It can be closer, very simply. It's on a more household level, meaning the dispersal locations are either in the neighborhood or with individual houses, or they can even be simple scatters. Okay, the control or decision-making processes concerning disposal is more individual rather than communal. Sites where the attributes are more intense, up here, we have a greater expenditure of energy to dispose of waste farther away. Okay, we don't have that option really to keep it any closer. Control and decisions are more often part of a centralized administration that decides and enforces where refuse can be dumped. Formation is also determined by these attributes. Okay, formation refers to the behavioral processes behind the accumulation of the dumps. Where these attributes are less intense again, because the decision-making processes are more individual at a household level, it seems that the processes can vary. Accumulation can come from one-time events or from recurrent episodic disposal. More intense, where we have centralized control determining where and how waste is disposed of. The formation process seems to be much more episodic and recurrent. It's not a single event, but rather the result of many discrete disposal activities. And recurrent meaning there is an extended lifespan of the dump. Finally, composition refers simply, well, not simply, composition is the most difficult part of this. It refers to the archaeological signature of the dump. Okay, what objects are a part of this assemblage. Okay, this is the measure of heterogeneity, encompassing both the richness of an assemblage, meaning the richness is how many different types of objects, how many different classes of objects are represented in a specific assemblage, and the evenness, the proportional abundance of each representative class. Now, when we talk about heterogeneity and homogeneity, we also need to talk about chronological variability among the classes of artifacts, sort of like the amount of residuality, the artifacts that appear in the archaeological record long after they cease to be made and used. Now, assemblages down here, the pattern seems to be more homogeneity. Now, this is pretty logical. We'll do a quick example really fast. And up here, on a more communal level, more citywide level, the composition seems to be much more heterogeneous. Okay, think of as an example how we throw away our waste. We start at the kitchen. Okay, our kitchen waste basket filled with a few classes, a few artifacts, organic waste. Paper towels, dishes, maybe broken glass or something. Now you put that in your general household waste, it becomes more heterogeneous. The homogeneity decreases. Why? Because more activities are now represented in this assemblage. You take this household waste, put it in the neighborhood dumpster, what do we get? More activities represented, greater measure of heterogeneity, right? And then finally, take that neighborhood dumpster to the communal dump. Wow, right? Now, can we apply these patterns that I've sort of established from other archaeological, ethno-archaeological studies to the Roman world? Now, I'm looking at a particular settlement type, right? The Roman city, specifically Rome, Ostia, Pompeii, and Cosa. Okay, now all of these appear really on the upper extreme of the spectrum of urban attributes, right? They're heavily built up, densely populated urban centers, girded by city walls, and occupied over centuries. Now, in each of the normal urban routines, such as ongoing construction and demolition events, as well as domestic, commercial, and industrial activities, generated significant amounts of waste. Its proper management and disposal was a quotidian chore. Refuse had to be moved so that it would not take up valuable intra-urban space and impede day-to-day operations. Enormous communal middens are regularly found outside of these city walls. I'm just going to give you some very quick examples and then sort of give you an idea of how I want to approach these examples, what sorts of information I want to glean from these examples. Well, at Rome, here we have the earlier Servian wall, okay, and this is the later 3rd century wall here, okay. We have numerous examples. Now, I've only brought in 3 official examples and a 4th sort of intuitive example here. A Republican dump, infamous through the description of it by Lanciani in the late 19th century, here was found on the Esquiline Hill. Closer to home, a large dump was found at the foot of the Janiculo, right here, excavated. Well, the publication is by Filippi in 2008. It was excavated a few years before that. And excavations in front of our Metro Line C coming in have uncovered numerous examples, and I only bring up one here. It's really, you think about them all, and it gets sort of overwhelming. This is recently found here in the area of Pineto, right down there. We're going to come back to this briefly. At Ostia, excavations uncovered a large dump outside of the perimeter wall at the east here, right below and south of the aqueduct. Okay, here's a photograph of some of the assemblage. Here is a plan showing the stratigraphy of this dump. It continued beyond the limits of the 3 trenches that were sunk so its full extent is unknown. But just to give you an idea of how large it was, one of the 3 trenches was 19 meters by 4 meters by 2 meters deep. Okay, and it extended throughout there and continued beyond these trenches. And of course, a great example at Pompeii. Excavations have uncovered dumps up to 2, maybe more meters high, abutting the city wall. We can see Maiori's excavations here, between the Herculaneum and the Vesuvian Gate, uncovered a stretch over 300 meters. Down here as well, he mentions another stretch at the south near the amphitheater entrance. Eitani and the Japanese Paleological Institute conducted campaigns of excavations outside of the city wall here to examine so-called Porta Capua. Was it really a porta, a gate? Well, they don't think it was. It was more of a gap. Okay, so they didn't find a gate, but they found massive deposits of waste. And we can see here, I don't know if you can see. You can't really. Trust me, there are smaller lines in there showing rather well the stratigraphy of this waste assemblage. But you can see it's abutting the city wall here. And it's about just over 2 meters high. This is a significant amount. Chiaramonte Trere's excavation here at the Nolan Gate uncovered garbage deposits extending through each of their 3 trenches, which were 6, 4.8, and 13 meters wide, respectively. Okay, finally at Cosa, an extramural dump was accidentally uncovered during the construction of a road built in preparation for the excavations inside of the colony back in 1949. This stretched 13 meters between towers 8 and 9, and Frank Brown in his excavation journal also mentions more of this stretch in between Tower 10 and the so-called Ark's Wall, which was never excavated. This was actually not their goal to excavate a trash dump. They wanted to go inside. So it really hasn't received the attention that it deserves. Now I plan to examine more closely the formation and especially the composition of these examples to create sort of a statistical index of their heterogeneity by measuring the richness and the evenness. Okay, this is, of course, much easier said than done. Recording methods immediately threaten the validity of measures like this. Were all objects even counted? Probably not. Okay, there are many, many problems to trying to figure out the composition. What sorts of materials are represented in a deposit such as this? More weight is often given to one class of artifact over another, with the result that some are just completely ignored. Take, for example, wall plaster. You find bits of wall plaster in a deposit. Wall plaster is a signal of a major event. Okay, while the artifact itself is rather minor. What we're talking about is a major construction or maybe demolition activity. Okay, if they're not counted, if they're not quantified, recorded, then that activity is completely lost. Okay. Another problem, my relation to statistics is sort of like David Hasselhoff's relationship to music. It might be there, but it's really not so good. So, if you at the end, if you want to give me ideas of, I've got books on how to measure, do quantity. And do statistical analysis of heterogeneity. Yeah, maybe somebody else knows better who can help. The descriptions, at least in the archaeological reports of the dumps, are similar from one to another. So we can sort of, without the statistics, intuit this heterogeneity, which isn't enough right now, but it's going to have to do. Ostia, there's a metric ton of pottery, as well as glass, metals, bone, building materials, etc., etc., etc. Okay, a massive amount. At Pineto in Rome, they found a chronological range from the 1st to the 3rd century AD, representing all material classes of the classical age. That's sort of my translation of what they wrote, leading them to conclude that this is a waste material coming from the city itself and not from an extra-urban villa. Often, however, the presence of dumps is not enough for some to recognize that there were provisions for the disposal of waste. Both at Pompeii and Cosa, the extramural mounds are generally thought to be ad hoc responses to natural or man-made disasters, and not the result of episodic and recurrent waste disposal. At Pompeii, many attribute these mounds simply to the cleanup from the earthquake of 62-63 AD. At Cosa, they attribute the mounds to the Augustan-era cleanup of the city, of this colony, after the sacking and subsequent abandonment 50 years earlier. Now, shout out number 2, as Ted Pena already recognized for Pompeii, recognize these for what they really are, the byproduct of managed disposal of urban waste. Now, I'm going to come inside the city, where large deposits of waste can be found nearly everywhere. Okay, and what is going on here? Where are they located? How are they formed? What are they composed of? What can we say about these intra-urban waste deposits? These appear with such regularity that it is actually possible to predict where they will be found. Broadly speaking, in contexts where there are large voids that for one reason or another needed to be filled, like vats and tanks and pits and between floors. Vat tank, we're going to get to this one later. Between floors, here we have 2 floors. We have a significant raising of the elevation of the space between this floor and that floor. Okay, this requires massive volumes of material. Now, these are not dumps, right? But they do share some important characteristics with dumps. In fact, their location, one would sort of intuit that, well, the location is not a characteristic that these intra-urban waste deposits share with dumps. Well, in fact, they do share the same characteristic. Remember, with a dump, the main motivation was hindrance avoidance, to get this out of the way. All of these examples that I'm here, many of these examples, there are other piles of litter that are in the way, but none of these are actually in the way. These are separated from the inhabitants. Every example here is actually beneath the feet, covered by floors and earth. Well, how did they get here? What are the formation processes? Well, this is where intra-urban waste deposits differ from these extramural dumps. Let's go over some ways people sort of try to explain the presence of intra-urban waste deposits. The very first one is there is no management, okay? Garbage in the city represents garbage-strewn cities. Now, this example is from Troy, Carl Blagan. It's not a Roman city, but it's my favorite example, and we can find examples of this coloring interpretations of excavations within Roman cities. Okay, there was no provision for the disposal of rubbish and waste. Everything discarded was dropped on the floor indoors or thrown out through the doorway onto the streets. Okay, what happens? The floors become so filled with animal bones and litter that eventually something needs to be done. Okay, well, they don't think, well, maybe we could clean this up. No, they say, we'll put a new floor on. Okay, so not by sweeping out the offensive accumulation, but by bringing in a good supply of fresh, clean clay and spreading it out thickly to cover the noxious deposit. Okay, later he writes, over centuries, this pattern of behavior caused the elevation of the city to rise, ultimately forming the large stratified mounds seen today. Now, I just read an excavation report on a Roman city in Libya yesterday that describes the 5 street surfaces in precisely the same way. Okay, now what's the real problem is, well, there's many problems with this, okay? We have cities that are entirely dysfunctional. But also, garbage is a principal agent of change here. Okay, to this urban infrastructure. City development was a consequence of unrestrained litter. I want to take an antithetical approach to the same evidence, that the inhabitants were the principal agents of change, and this garbage was this tool used to develop the urban infrastructure. Now, management. Some people see these intra-urban waste deposits as examples of management. Often, people read them as becoming formed from highly localized sources. Materials were needed for construction projects, and they came from what was directly at hand. So here's a nice, a picture of me thinking about what this means. A house with construction events needing materials for different reasons and using the materials strictly at hand. Okay, now this is definitely possible at some point, sometimes. But not very often. Okay. Often, the volume of material needed was simply too great to believe that it came from one single place, like, say, the house. A measure of the heterogeneity of the assemblages found is also helpful. Is the richness, is this variety so great that we can start to think that the source came from somewhere else and not just the single space, this house? Well, then people say, okay, well, this came from other parts of the city. I've created an illustration here of what I take this to mean. Various events, such as construction or demolition projects around the city, produced detritus that workers transported, maybe directly to places where this material was needed. Now, this model requires a one-to-one relationship between supply and demand. While this is definitely possible, it's more difficult. The supply of fill had to be generated each time there was a demand for it, and the supply had to be of an adequate volume to meet the considerable demand. Furthermore, it depends on a high degree of communication and coordination to know where to transport materials. Now, it's very possible that this is how this formation took place, but I think there's a more convenient solution that does not depend on supply produced simply ad hoc, and that was those very extra-urban dumps, or the extra-urban middens that we've already been talking about, where significant amounts of waste from normal urban routines, such as construction and demolition, as well as domestic, commercial, industrial activities, accumulated. And separation of the garbage from the city was temporary in this case, and it was imported back into the city. Now again, it's been recognized that individual objects could be mined from the dumps to re-enter the city if it held potential reuse value, like the pottery sherds. Okay, architectural elements such as marble or wall stones. But here, maybe we can allow that all the refuse, not just specific objects, were reclaimed en masse because it was a valuable source of fill material. And it was reclaimed from this accessible and convenient source to be used in subsequent events, construction, demolition events. I want to give you another picture of what this means. Now, different activities in the city generated discrete assemblages of waste that were deposited on top of and beside one another in this extramural dump, or the midden here. And this is a very, very simple sort of picture of what's going on in my head here, where we get the discrete, recurrent activities creating what we can call cells, okay, of different types of materials: domestic, industrial, demolition, commercial, what have you know, so on and so on and so on. Again, this is very simple. It's probably much more complex than this, but it's a good start, good illustration. This was reclaimed. Here, we've now scooped it away as reclamation, brought back into the city as deposition. Sorry. Now this would, okay, I'm sorry, this would account for the high amount of richness in these intramural waste deposits. Objects that originally had no functional, spatial, or chronological relationship with one another now become part of the same infill. And they acquire a new shared function, albeit invisible and inactive, as construction, or more specifically, fill material. Now, finally, this pattern of reclamation would also ease an important concern about refuse collection. Because the extramural discard was a regular and managed system of waste disposal rather than an ad hoc response to a natural or man-made catastrophe, part of its management must have taken into account the ever-growing accumulation. Without a strategy of removing the refuse, the volume would soon become too great, and a steady reclamation of its parts for later use controlled this volume. The impact of incoming waste from within the city was negated, or at least lessened, by the removal of refuse going back into the city. Consequently, the composition of intramural waste deposits share the same measure of heterogeneity. I'm going to give you just a few examples of what I mean by this. If we look at the composition of we're going to talk about what fill this is, but an intramural refuse fill, we see a high measure of richness, a wide variety of pottery classes, from trade and commercial to domestic, representing the highly variegated elements of a Roman urban setting. We have other objects, including construction debris, brick and tile, plaster, painted, plaster, unpainted, mortar, cacio pesto, as well as various small finds, I call them. Now, this doesn't even really speak to the true variety of this. When I say, for example, lead, these can be military, lead sling bullets. They can be infrastructure, lead water, parts of lead water pipes. Okay, so we're just talking strictly about classes, but the functions can be even more diverse than I can possibly put on a graph such as this. Now, this came from what I'm going to call a quarry pit, found in the back garden of a house. That was now, in this house, little development took place, with the result that, if you can see here, the ancient soils remained undisturbed. Okay, the soils are accumulations from millennia of Vesuvian eruptions. Strata of ash-rich earth called pozzolano, which was a highly effective aggregate in mortar and plaster. It was extracted and carted away, leaving behind a large void that needed to be filled with an equally large volume of fill. More fill than was obviously immediately available within the property itself, and the materials, I believe, came from this community dump, which offered a ready and cheap alternative. Composition of this location, a tank fill. Numerous constructed voids, tanks, and vats, and wells, and cisterns, after becoming obsolete, were filled in and covered over. We can see here part of a tank. Its top portion has been kicked in. It's been filled in. You can see this real chunky material here. Like the previous one, representing the broad spectrum of urban life in the city here. Numerous different classes of pottery and small finds down here, including architectural elements. I bring this up here because some people say, okay, you're bringing in the trash. What about the noxious parts of it, the noxious elements, the decaying, butchered remains, things like this? Well, if we see here, animal bones, there were a number. There was quite a lot. 889 animal bones found within this context, but nothing very large. In fact, the average weight of a single animal bone was 1.8 grams. Tiny little thing. So they're thinking about things like this before they bring it in. Keep out the noxious. Sort of curate this trash. Know what you're bringing in so it's not disgusting. It's not noxious. Okay? Then smaller things, fish bones, eggshell, land shell, marine shell. We talked about Carl Blagan's floor fill. This is a great example of when this material is coming in. Okay, and I have this example again here because it's such a wonderful section of a trench from Pompeii. We see big, huge opus signum flooring on top of another one, but in between here we have a major raising of the room, probably due to a reconstruction of the house itself. Well, in order to raise this about 50 centimeters, a massive amount of material needed to be brought into the room first. Okay, and once again, a composition with a high degree of richness. Representing different activities of urban life. I'm going to go back here one time to talk about chronological variability. Okay, in contexts such as this, we can very easily find, say, Terrace Gelata, 200 pieces here, dating to the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, right next to, say, Bucaro, 500 years, older, dating from 500, 600 BC. So there's a great deal of chronological variability as well. This one is an interesting one from the House of Sallust. We're going to call this another quarry pit. It was a small pit located in the back corner of this open courtyard. Also, the excavators have identified this or believe this was created to extract the pozzolano for construction purposes. It's not a very big one, but look at the heterogeneity, this richness and the evenness. Okay, we have really much, very similar sorts of objects coming out of this. The richness is not quite so great. Okay, amphora, very few. Everything else more or less domestic, right? Domestic cookware, domestic servingware. What's really interesting is this representation of painted plaster. Okay, single color or decorated with geometric forms, or figural. 4 of these figural plasters are, one can identify a fresco of a garden scene with lattice work. Okay, in this case, it is very possible by looking at the composition to say that very likely this is possibly from a highly localized source, the house itself. The painted plaster might have very well been the early decoration of this wall. And what we're looking at is repair work after the earthquake of 62 or 63, extraction of pozzolano, and the refilling of this hole with localized materials, local materials from the house itself. So it does vary, and I believe through a more rigorous statistical analysis, we can get at why or what the source actually is. Now, why does this matter? Real quick, the last maybe 5 minutes, I want to look at sort of a case study. Okay, get everybody who's not really an archaeologist on the same page here, why this matters. Now, if you go back to Blagan, where he says, this is litter, right? They deposited it, it accumulated, you cover it. Well, then what this means is, when we excavate these materials, when we find these materials, these objects, we can use these objects to talk about the function of the space, because they were used there. Okay, this is called the primary context, right? If it was all imported, then it really has nothing to do with the space itself, right? This is a secondary context. But if you really misinterpret it, then you're really sort of misidentifying what can be said about the space in which the object is found. And this is from actually a great catalog of coins coming from Pompeii. But when we start to interpret the distribution of the coins, it gets a little questionable. Okay, we get 2 types of coins: live coinage, which was abandoned money. Provides a snapshot of the currency in use at the time of the eruption itself, at 79. Sort of abandoned at 79. It was still an active part of the town's wealth storage and commercial activity. And we have dead. Okay, back to the metaphor of life and death. Okay, death is the coins recovered from below 79 AD. How did they get there? Their formation. Well, they were lost, discarded, hoarded, buried, and never recovered. Nowhere do we see imported, brought in from trash or somewhere else. What are the implications of this? well, we can use this distribution of coins to really talk about function. Okay, the economic function of this city block in which these coins are found. Right? Distributed across the insula, and how this relates to the function of the different parts of the block. The commercial areas, be they bars or workshops, were the areas where the most daily transactions were taking place. So were the most likely areas for small change to be accidentally dropped and trodden into the ground, which eventually formed the archaeological record. Once again, maybe. The thing is, this could very well be right. But we're not looking specifically at every single context in which these coins were found to see how they got there, right? So real quick, like case study and sort of examination is the distribution of votives over a city block. To what extent does a distribution of votives indicate ritual activity on a site? All right. I'm going to do some votives, 150 in total from the Pompeii excavations at Porta Stabia. And votives include, well, we can talk about votives. We identify votives either by their typology or by the context in which they were found, where they're unmistakably votives. A statuette of a goddess, miniature votive cups and bowls, often with remains still in them. This is a terracotta foot that was a common votive. These anatomical terracottas from the 4th century, 3rd century, 2nd century were commonly deposited as votives at sanctuary spaces. Anyway, we excavated 100. We found in our excavations between 2005 and 2012, 150 objects. Okay, the distribution is plotted here. Okay, nothing but the distribution, nothing but the context. What does this say about ritual activity in Insula 8.7 and Insula 1.1? Well, 28 out of the 41 trenches contained votives. Most 21 trenches had a small number from 1 to 5. 5 contained moderately more, between 9 and 12. 2 contained a lot. Up here, 20. And wow, down here, holy smokes, that is a holy site, right? 30 in one. Well, can we really infer certain characteristics of the rooms in which they were found, such as like a correlation between votive presence and sacred significance of space? What does this suggest, these anomalies? Was ritual performance more intense? Now, this room with this space here with 20, this is actually where that quarry pit is located, which I mentioned earlier, where with a fill comprised of many pottery classes, ranging from the 6th century to the BC to the 1st century AD, as well as demolition debris, all sorts of pottery. Included among the finds were these 20 votive objects. Now, does this indicate ritual activity? Of course not. Right? The volume of the fill was so massive that it needed to be sourced from somewhere else. And I believe this extramural dump would have been the source. Now, if the formation process of the fill is the result of mass importation, then nothing in this deposit, votives included, can be used to speak about activities here, ritual or otherwise. So we can omit these 20 from our distribution. Now, other similar pits were identified during the course of excavations, and we can treat them. We're going to just go through this quickly. We can treat them in the same way. These were imported. We can't say they're primary. We can take them out of consideration too. There we go, leaving us with 114 votives. Now let's move to other contexts. What about that pit fill that was brought up earlier? Okay, that vat. These constructed voids appear throughout our site here, and when they were no longer needed, they were filled in, requiring huge volumes of fill material that were not immediately available. Again, the source material would have been possibly what I believe is extramural dumps. So once again, there's no way to comfortably assign activity to a space when the material evidence is imported and not in their original primary context. So we can erase those. reducing the number now to 105. Now to those floor fills and other types of leveling fills. A leveling fill generally is used to even out terrain or raise the elevation of rooms or entire properties. And this one above all really affected the development of this insula more than any other fill type. As a consequence, more votives appear in these sorts of fills than any other. 61 votives. Okay, 61 votives not in their primary context, 61 votives we can take out. This leaves us with 44, okay, in their primary context. Now, does primary context, where their place of use, actually mean ritual? Okay, no. We're going to keep going a little bit further here. If the distribution of votives in their primary context spoke to ritual activity in these spaces, we have a lot to say about this space here. We still do anyway. It's very interesting. But there's nothing about this room that made it more sacred. So primary context here does not equate to ritual context. Prior to the construction of the houses here, we had a 3rd to 2nd century potter's workshop, okay, producing and selling votives along with domestic vessels. Now, the image to the right shows a wonderfully preserved kiln in what is now room 5. 60 commonware juglets were found in the kiln's destruction layer, as well as 2 votive cups. And the image to the left is another kiln that was possibly, most likely, went out of use before the one to the right, and it was reused as a place, a small disposal site for the other kiln. And we find numerous broken sherds, wasters, vessel supports, which are used in kilns to separate vessels while firing, as well as 15 votive cups and bowls. It's interesting to note, that these votives exhibited imperfections from firing. We can see these clearly, these broke in half during firing. But we also see here, you can see it there, and there are these cracks. Okay, this says something nice about the efficacy of votives, right? They have to be perfect. They have to be functional, even if they're being used sort of metaphorically and ritually and spiritually. They have to function just like a normal tableware would. And if they don't, then they get disposed of. We're talking here about the economy of ritual and not ritual practice itself. But since they're not ritual, let's take them away. And there we have 27 votives. Less than 20% of the original were deposited during ritual activity. These three, 6, 6, and 9, respectively, were deposited in ritual pits. Okay, so it's unmistakable that these were ritual. We can see here a ritual pit where all 9 miniature cups were placed along the northern edge here with food remains in them, and then it was burned. Okay, the same thing across the street, a ritual pit that was later cut by later activity, not by us. And down at Porta Stabia here, as a point of transition, Porta Stabia was a sacred spot. Okay, there is an altar placed in the wall of the gate, and votive offerings deposited here. Unmistakable ritual context. The final 2 were small votives that were placed inside walls during the construction, and we believe that they were votives asking that these walls remained standing, right? So there's great disparity between the total number of votives and actual ritual behavior. Only 27 are found in context of ritual use. So what I really want to get at is the distribution of certain classes of artifacts within a site must be accompanied by a full understanding, a full knowledge of each context and its formation process. Okay, by accounting for this, we can produce more rigorous interpretations of the artifacts themselves in the context they represent. And a further understanding of waste management and the circulation of garbage and a further understanding of waste management and the circulation of garbage outside and inside of the city is crucial to this. The Romans did provide for the disposal of waste in a systematic and centralized way. Massive city dumps attest to this. And the urban intra-urban waste deposits reflect a sophisticated reuse of their waste and shows a way to view and value garbage with which we ourselves are completely unfamiliar. Okay, thank you very much. Oh, yeah.
A fascinating talk. Certainly, I can imagine the archaeologists among the group, if not anybody among the group, probably has several questions for Kevin. I'd love to open the floor to those.
Yeah. Yeah.
Head that you just showed in the photos objects. Do you know what that was? Do you imagine?
There are some comparanda from Pompeii. I mean, there is a similar head that has been identified as Athena. Now, I don't know. No. But this was a head coming from Pompeii as well, and this is what we have. But no, I really couldn't say. I can't give. I would say a goddess, but specifically, no. I wish I could.
Do you see anything of the Eleusinian mysteries there?
Mm,
Anything about the Eleusinian mysteries?
not in the archaeological record. No. Nope. No. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. This was great. As you were talking, I was thinking about the distinction that you made at the beginning between sort of central control and individual control.
Yes.
And it seemed to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that most of the things you showed us today would seem to fit into the individual control column more than...
Like, in what way?
Well, the contexts that are close to the city. I mean...
Oh, you mean the dumps themselves? These.
Right. Sort of just beyond the city walls.
Okay.
The urban context.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, but maybe you also haven't dealt with the ones that are further away from the city yet, because those seem to be the ones in Rome, which I think, if I understand correctly, haven't looked at yet. But I'm wondering, can we also imagine the periphery of the city to be full of dump sites that are maybe a little bit bigger or different from the ones that you showed us?
Right. That's it's a good question. I mean, it's so difficult to say. I mean, first, as in terms of like different, there very well could be. Now, have they been discovered? It's hard to say. Maybe not. In terms of individual, I think in the ancient world we have decisions made by a centralized authority, but individual responsibility. Okay, when we look at like the literary texts, the legal texts, the epigraphy, we have an administration that's willing to come down hard on a population that doesn't take their individual responsibility. We also have texts, epigraphy, outside of the city wall stating where you can deposit the trash. Okay, so I think, yes, on the one hand, the individual is responsible, but it's coming, these orders and these decisions are coming from this higher order. So.
Thanks so much, Kevin. As you know, I'm super fan of this project. It's super interesting. I have, I guess, some detailed question and a bigger picture question. The first is, you keep talking about these assemblages being rich, right? And I assume
Right.
that one of the things you're trying to get at is, yeah, kind of, but they all kind of are, right? I mean, what do you mean by that?
Okay.
I'm going to put flesh on the bone.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that finding a statistical method that allows you to quantify that richness using the imperfect data sets that you have, right, that are also not terribly compatible, is kind of essential to getting at this, right? Because simply saying they're rich.
Yeah, trying to get some intuitive thing that, oh, this is
There's lots of different stuff in my garbage.
yes, okay,
Which is kind of like,
yes,
okay.
which is why, right, in an ideal world, we would want a statistical measure to compare intra-urban with intra-urban, extra-urban dumps with extra-urban dumps, and intra-urban with extra-urban. And there are ways, there are methods, but people are very open to the fact that it's extraordinarily difficult. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Keep.
Okay, so my question is, I mean, that's where you're at right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to actually quantify some of these. What do you want to be able to say about this? What's the big sort
yes.
of social historical question
Mm-hmm.
or hypothesis that you're posing here, aside from the negative, which is a lot of this stuff we can't actually use as evidence for lived experience because it's felt.
Right.
That's the negative thing. What I want to ask is, what's the big positive argument you're going to make about this book once you actually are able to put some quantitative flesh on the bones of the data sets that you have?
Okay. Yep. Well, first, okay. Back to lived experience. There are. I don't want to be completely nihilistic about this and say that you can say nothing about these assemblages, and you really can on a broader scale. We can talk about citywide consumption and what's coming in, citywide activities. In terms of positive argument, I really think through a statistical analysis we can get at I hope I can get at exactly how these intramural deposits are being formed. Can we actually say statistically that some of these are coming from these extramural dumps? Okay, I really do think that this is a way to speak to the development of urban infrastructure. Okay, a lot of the archaeological reports do say, yes, garbage was brought in and used as fill. Okay, can we statistically show which ones are where they were coming from? And I think a measure of the richness and a measure of evenness, which combines to form a measure of heterogeneity, can help us sort of get at a better understanding of where they're coming from. I do think this also says something about the value of waste. There's a lot of things, a lot of ideas circulating that said, there's two things that are deposited outside of the city. There's the dead and there's garbage. And maybe the garbage is viewed much like the dead, but I really think no. It was much, much different than that. We're looking at waste as a highly productive resource, and it's not being viewed as this like miasma. It's being seen as something that is a tool and can be used. But the way you get right at the problem here is, how do we do the statistics? And there are books about this on statistics of diversity is the title of one, and he, this author Leonard says immediately, it's hard. It's really the richness, measuring statistically richness is easier statistically. Evenness is extraordinarily difficult. So, but.
I also think, though, that some of your ideas, we were talking before, about what you're calling curated, I'm calling pre-selected deposits that share a certain set of characteristics. There's your shared set of connections. Either the size, the fact that they have been sieved or and otherwise curated to remove organic matter. Stuff like this actually does give you insight into a system of, I live in Philadelphia, where the whole city is surrounded by select kinds of junkyards, right? Where you buy and sell certain kinds of junk,
yes.
right? You can imagine, if your hypothesis is that there is a sophisticated waste disposal system, there's also a sophisticated recycling system.
Absolutely.
Right? In which
Yep.
there's all kinds of dirty fill for sale.
Absolutely.
That range from, big chunks of stuff to fill a hole quickly
Right.
to really clean stuff that doesn't have a lot of organic matter that's good for filling floors.
Right. Yes. And they're great. Yeah, like in Philly, in Pompeii, right near our dig house, there's an example of this where they have separated everything, and I call it curation, but it's the same thing. Where even before it's disposed of, you're looking through it. You're picking out the things that can be of use. But then again, you're putting away all of this material in this massive dump, but that too has just as much value. So there's reuse and recycling on so many levels. I mean, there's great work on recycling of construction, walls, wall stones, marble. But I think it does happen on many more levels than we think.
I'll give you time for one more question, and then we'll take our conversation upstairs. Feel free to.
Evie, yeah.
This is a question we can talk about another time too, but I just wondered about, because it's so fascinating, that you just bring this idea together to someone who does not study archaeology, but it is really, for me, a creative way of thinking about how and what and why it happens. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The other thing though is that there is so much data, like to the point of like little plaster dust.
Oh, yeah.
Big. And I'm thinking about, do you have plans or ideas to how to use visual a lot more in the book, like layers, or I imagine, like, because there's a lot of speculation, or like, what if it looked like this, and it's sort of, I don't know, I have just visual ideas of how to make it more visual, because then it's more tangible. I'm not saying that you're not doing that.
Oh, yeah.
You may have a whole plan for it, but I get excited thinking about it. I think the opportunity of, I don't know, making that an aspect of the book in archaeology.
Yeah. Okay. So more specifically, the visuality of the.
All the data you have,
Yeah.
sort of how to visualize it, which is like maybe you can work with another person, or maybe you already know how to do it. I don't know, but I see there's some really, there's just ways, and like I said, we could talk about it another time, because
Yeah. No, it sounds really. I think things like tools like that would be great. I mean, doing this, it was extraordinarily difficult to figure out what to say and how to say it, because it's so complicated. But new ways to express this information is very welcome. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
even when you're doing visually, when you compare, you pull off the layer, this is here, this is there, but
Mm-hmm.
in a physical book or a CD-ROM, still like it's like a, and it's just about like tangibility, tactile.
Yeah, that's great. I would love to talk to you more. Thanks.
Why don't we just take you upstairs
Okay.
and talk more about that and the other things that are on people's minds. Thank you very much, Kevin, for this
Thank you.
talk, and thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
A lot of data to work with. I don't
Oh,
actually have
no, I know. No, I mean, the good thing is